Picture this. You come home after burying your father. 6 weeks of hospital fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, and the slow heartbreak of saying goodbye. And there it is, an entire subdivision being poured onto your family's ranch. Concrete trucks, bulldozers, people with clipboards wearing sunglasses indoors, 75 identical houses already halfway framed on land that's been yours for 134 years. And standing in your kitchen is a woman with perfect teeth, holding your father's coffee mug, telling you with a pitying little smile, "Oh, honey, your daddy signed it over, didn't he tell you?" That's how Garrett Rusty Thornfield found out his family legacy had been sliced, diced, and sold off like discount beef. And no, his daddy didn't sign anything, not in his right mind, not even close, but that didn't matter to the HOA president with a personal stylist and a husband on city council, because in their world, paperwork wins wars unless someone fights dirty, real dirty, and what they didn't know was this. Rusty had been raised by droughts, bulls, and broken promises, and if they wanted a war over property lines, he was about to give them one. Full Texas thunderstorm style, no mercy, no retreat, just boots on the dirt and blood in the water. Welcome to Thornfield Estates, where HOA stands for hell on arrival. Stick around, folks, because by the time this tale ends, those 75 cookie-cutter dreams will be flattened by more than just a legal technicality. This is the real-life revenge story of how one rancher turned a neighborhood fantasy into a federal disaster. And halfway through, I'll ask you to comment "No King" in the cul-de-sac, not once, but twice, to join the resistance against HOA madness and show them who really owns the land. Let's dig in. Rusty Thornfield wasn't the type to yell. He didn't throw punches, didn't slam doors. He just stood. Still, the way a longhorn does before charging. So when Vivian Ashworth Sterling, the Lululemon-clad HOA queen of suburbia, told him he had 30 days to vacate his own damn ranch, he didn't explode. He didn't argue. He walked out to the barn, stood under the old windmill creaking like an arthritic elbow, and let the silence wrap around him like armor. The land spoke louder than she ever could. You see, this land wasn't a parcel on a spreadsheet. It was his father's ashes scattered under the live oak. It was the soil where his grandfather's hands bled pulling wire fences during the Dust Bowl. It was the ground that taught him the smell of mesquite, the patience of cattle, and the price of survival. And now some Barbie in boardroom heels had the nerve to hand him photocopied eviction papers claiming her LLC held title to half his soul. Rusty knew something was wrong the moment she pushed those documents across his kitchen table. The signature was too clean, too foreign. His daddy had been hallucinating during chemo when that date was signed. The man once tried to use the TV remote to call a nurse. No way he signed off on 847 acres. And that's when the silence broke. Not with a scream, but with movement. A deputy sheriff knocking at his door, a city lawyer in a silk tie smirking like this was just a paperwork error, a check for $50,000 to buy him out. For all of it, his family's entire history for the cost of a used Tesla, but the insult buried deepest came when they said the magic words, eminent domain. That meant if he didn't leave, they'd call it a public safety concern, a loophole, a legal weapon, a way to steal the American dream and call it civic progress. The HOA had moved in like termites in a fresh build, quiet, relentless, and protected by the system. But what they didn't know, Rusty wasn't just a rancher, he was a survivor. And this war, it was just getting started. The land had endured drought, fire, bankers, and bureaucrats. It would endure this HOA, and so would he. The real war began with a phone call, one Rusty made to the courthouse basement, where dust hung in the air like old secrets, and the woman who answered the phone had filed more land surveys than most lawyers had lies. Dolores Martinez, county surveyor for 37 years, 67 years old, wore bifocals on a chain and spoke like every sentence ended with a warning. When Rusty told her someone had moved his property markers 200 feet closer to the barn while he was at his father's deathbed, she didn't even pause. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, and she meant it. Dolores showed up with maps older than most HOA board members' Botox, and when she laid them out on Rusty's kitchen table, the same table where Vivian had sipped coffee from his father's mug, you could feel the shift. The air went still, like the land itself was holding its breath. "These markers," she said, pointing with a gnarled finger, "haven't moved since 1923, and now they're gone. That's a third-degree felony in Texas, sweetheart." You could see it then, plain as day. Someone had forged an entire development map based on false borders. The permits were fast-tracked over Christmas break when the Planning Commission was skiing in Aspen. The environmental study? Filed 6 months before his father allegedly signed anything. And the real kicker? The development already included his land on paper long before the ink ever hit those photocopied signatures. This wasn't just an accident, it was a coordinated heist in khakis and court shoes. Dolores, who hated corruption like ranchers hate drought, pulled out a manila folder marked Confidential Thornfield Expansion. Inside were purchase agreements, 12 of them, each for neighboring properties. All bought cheap, all sold under pressure. Tax liens, zoning threats, mysterious code violations. A pattern so obvious it may as well have been printed in neon ink. "This, boxed you in," Dolores said, lighting a cigarette under a no-smoking sign. "They scared your neighbors, bought up everything around you. You're the last domino, and they're trying to knock you over." But Rusty wasn't falling, not this time, because he didn't just have land. He had history, he had legal rights, and now he had proof. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was precedent. If they could do this to him, they could do it to anyone. And that's when he made a vow, right there at the kitchen table. "They want to build over my roots? Fine, but I'll make damn sure the foundation cracks." That night, Rusty walked the property line like a man reclaiming a stolen birthright. The stars overhead blinked down on barbed wire that had been set by his great-grandfather's hands. A fence line older than the subdivision blueprints sitting in a city file cabinet. He carried a GPS unit in one hand, a flashlight in the other, and a camera strapped to his chest. Every step was a piece of evidence. Every boundary stake replaced by orange plastic was a new offense. And then he found it, half buried beneath decades of soil, tucked behind a mesquite tree. The original 1923 concrete boundary marker, etched with the name Thornfield in barely faded script. Solid as stone. Because it was stone. The land didn't lie. The HOA had moved survey lines. That meant felony fraud. Rusty's hands trembled, not from fear, but from clarity. They hadn't just underestimated him. They'd overplayed their hand. And in Texas, that gets you burned. Next morning, Rusty made the second most important phone call of his life, to a man named Jake Kowalski, an environmental attorney with a grudge against developers and a resume full of wins that made billionaires sweat. Jake grew up one ranch over. His family had been forced off their land a decade ago by the same kind of scheme that was now swallowing Rusty's world. But Jake went to law school on rage and scholarship money, and he picked up Rusty's call like it had been ringing in his gut for 10 years. "Heard you've got HOA termites in your foundation," Jake said. "Time to fumigate." They met in the barn, spread the maps on a hay bale, and got to work. Jake pointed to a shaded zone on the satellite overlay. "See that? That's federally protected wetland. Vivian built her McMansions right on top of it. No permits, no mitigation, just illegal slabs on stolen marsh. That was a federal offense, not civil, criminal, and it came with fines that could crush a Fortune 500 company." But that wasn't the best part. Jake pulled out one last document, a yellowed piece of paper with rusted staples and government seals. "Your great-grandfather didn't just homestead the land, Rusty. He filed for full mineral rights. Oil, gas, water table, everything beneath the surface, it's yours. And she's been digging through it without permission." Rusty blinked. That meant every utility line, every septic tank, every foundation, all illegal trespass. Suddenly, he was the one with leverage, and the storm clouds weren't just in the sky anymore. They were in the courtroom, and they were rolling in fast. Vivian Ashworth Sterling had spent her life mastering one thing: control. Control the conversation, control the narrative, control the optics. And for a while it worked. She called her PR firm, Pinnacle Crisis Management, the same people who'd rehabbed oil tycoons and disgraced mayors, and unleashed a reputation war like Rusty had never seen. News crews camped outside his ranch. Headlines called him a bitter land baron blocking affordable housing. Tearful young couples appeared on Channel 8 saying they'd poured life savings into dream homes now held hostage by one selfish old man with a cowboy complex. Meanwhile, Vivian posed for photo ops in front of foundation slabs, all pastel blazer and crocodile empathy. "Progress always has its opponents," she told reporters, "but this isn't about property. This is about people." But that was her fatal misstep. Because Rusty was people. And now he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every small-town landowner steamrolled by slick lawyers and rigged systems. While the HOA hosted wine tastings and media tours, Rusty and Jake were in the trenches. They filed federal complaints backed by aerial photographs of bulldozed wetlands, drone footage of polluted creeks, and sworn affidavits from environmental experts. Jake brought in hydrologists, wildlife biologists, and one furious EPA officer who looked like she hadn't slept since the Bush administration. Together, they built a case so strong it could knock teeth out. But Vivian wasn't done. She cranked up the pressure. HOA security guards, real ex-military contractors, started tailing Rusty on his own land. One claimed he was trespassing on his own pasture. Another claimed he'd threatened workers with a shotgun. Total fabrication, but enough to get him plastered across the 6 o'clock news with flashing lights and a blurred mugshot. Then came the ultimate low blow. Vivian filed a court petition to have Rusty declared mentally unfit. She said grief had made him unstable, cited unpaid medical bills, old bankruptcy records from the 1980s. Even hired a so-called psychiatrist who had never met Rusty to file a diagnosis based on observable behavior patterns. The goal? Strip him of legal standing, cut him off at the knees. But Rusty had one weapon Vivian couldn't outspend: truth. And a growing army of allies who saw through the Botox and bougie fake kindness. One of those allies was you. If you've made it this far, comment "No King in the cul-de-sac" twice below to show you're one of us. A neighbor who's done being bullied. Let's flood the algorithm and make sure HOA tyranny gets exactly what it deserves. The sky cracked open 3 days later, literally. Thunder rolled in like war drums, and with it came the kind of Texas storm that doesn't ask permission, it just takes. What started as a heavy drizzle turned into a biblical downpour, the kind that floods creeks, overflows culverts, and tests the integrity of every corner those developers had cut. And make no mistake, Vivian's crew had cut plenty. Rusty stood on his porch that night, boots planted in red clay turned slick and angry, and watched as the hillside began to move. Construction debris washed down like a landslide of karma. Foundation trenches became rivers. Retaining walls collapsed like bad poker hands. One by one, those 75 pastel-painted dreams, half-built and barely legal, began to crack, shift, and in some cases sink. It was like Mother Nature herself had read the court filings. But this wasn't luck, it was justice. Because Jake's team had already submitted proof to the EPA that the wetland protections had been violated. The permits were fraudulent, the environmental impact studies were cooked. And those drainage systems, designed for a fantasy map that ignored the real floodplain, because building right up to the edge of federal wetlands wasn't just greedy. It was dangerous. When the first retaining wall collapsed and sent 2 porta potties flying into the HOA Welcome Center, even the construction crews bailed. By dawn, streets were underwater, concrete was cracked, and a 3-car garage had floated 100 feet into what used to be pasture. Channel 8 came back, this time with a different tone. Suddenly, Rusty wasn't a villain, he was a prophet. "We didn't listen," one anchor said, "and now the land is speaking louder than any lawsuit." Vivian tried to spin it, blamed unforeseen climate volatility, but Rusty had the receipts, pictures, dates, expert reports signed in ink. One by one, her pillars crumbled. The insurance companies, they bailed the moment the word felony hit the filings. The title insurer filed a fraud claim to void every buyer's policy. And the banks froze Ashworth Development's assets pending federal investigation. Within 72 hours, buyers were panicking. Lawyers were Arkling, and the HOA Facebook group turned into a digital firing squad, with Vivian as the sole target. Rusty didn't celebrate. He simply stood on his porch watching the rain clean the land like a baptism. And when Jake showed up, drenched but smiling, they both knew this wasn't just a win. It was a reckoning. And the war had officially turned. They say power corrupts, but HOAs, they corrupt with a clipboard and a smile. And now, Vivian Ashworth Sterling was watching her empire unravel thread by thread. The very community she promised to build had turned against her with a vengeance. Homeowners, some of whom had paid over $500,000 for unpermitted slabs on saturated soil, began lawyering up. Some discovered their deeds were void due to the mineral rights they never knew existed. Others learned their property lines overlapped Rusty's legal boundaries by as much as 20 feet. One man cried outside the HOA office when he realized his backyard was technically a toxic runoff site. Vivian held emergency meetings full of cold coffee, fake concern, and crocodile tears. "We were misled," she claimed. "Even I didn't know the full picture." But the paper trail said otherwise. Jake had dug it all up. The environmental shortcuts, the falsified signatures, the phone records between her and the city commissioners. It was political corruption painted in suburban beige. Meanwhile, Rusty kept walking his fence line every morning. His quiet routine had become symbolic, a man literally guarding history from erasure. Neighbors who once sneered at him now stopped by to shake his hand. One woman brought homemade peach pie. Another offered to help pay his legal fees, but Rusty didn't want money. He wanted something deeper, dignity restored. The next blow came when Jake filed a motion to halt all construction under the Clean Water Act and obtained a court injunction signed by a federal judge. It froze every nail, every brick, every dollar. Trucks were turned away at the gate, concrete deliveries were canceled, and a giant red notice was stapled to the HOA welcome sign. Development suspended pending federal investigation. The sign didn't last long. Vivian tore it down the next morning in a fit of rage, but someone filmed it. The video went viral. A woman in pearls screaming and clawing at a federal warning like it owed her child support. Comment sections exploded, memes were made. HOA Karen was canceled, and Rusty, he became a folk hero. TikTok dubbed him the rancher who fought the HOA and won. But the victory was still incomplete, because the real closure wasn't viral fame, it was accountability. And that would come in the courtroom, where Rusty planned to lay out every forged signature, every bribe, and every square inch of stolen land like an indictment of modern greed. One more storm was coming, and this time, he was bringing it. The courthouse smelled like lemon disinfectant and stale secrets, perfect for the showdown that was about to unfold. Rusty sat in the second row, boots polished but worn, Stetson in his lap, and Jake beside him with a stack of binders thick enough to anchor a boat. On the other side of the aisle, Vivian Ashworth Sterling had traded her designer workout gear for a Navy power suit, flanked by 3 lawyers from a firm with marble floors and no soul. Her smile was gone. In its place, panic painted as poise. The judge was a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair and no tolerance for drama. She listened quietly as Jake laid it all bare. Every shady transaction, every boundary moved, every falsified permit. He presented historic deeds, surveyor testimony, GPS logs, and environmental violations so severe they bordered on eco-terrorism. The mineral rights documents, ironclad. The EPA complaints, verified and lethal. Your Honor, Jake said, cool as steel, not only did the defendants knowingly build on protected land without permits, but they also constructed homes over subsurface property they did not own. That's NIS. To development. That's fraud on a geological level. Vivian's team tried everything. They blamed junior associates, claimed misunderstandings, waved excuses like confetti. But the judge wasn't having it. When she saw the photo of Rusty's great-grandfather's boundary stone still embedded in the earth, she stopped flipping pages. This land tells the truth, she said, and the truth doesn't care about your spreadsheets. The verdict came fast. Development halted indefinitely, all permits revoked, and a full federal investigation into Ashworth Development Group's dealings. Civil suits were greenlit, personal liability was on the table. And as Rusty walked out of that courtroom, the entire HOA board looked like they'd just been run over by a cattle drive. But the real justice came the next morning. The local paper ran a front-page story titled, "Rancher Restores Legacy, Exposes HOA Corruption." Rusty didn't speak to the press, didn't grandstand. He just stood on his land and breathed. The air smelled different now, clean, earned. And as the wind moved through the old live oaks where his father's ashes rested, Rusty swore he could hear the land exhale too. Not in relief, in respect. Because some people build homes, others defend roots. And in the end, that's what won. Not the money, not the lawyers, but one man's refusal to be erased. They say the land remembers, and so do the people who watched Rusty Thornfield take on a machine built to erase men like him. 3 months after the courtroom verdict, the development site looked like a ghost town. Half-poured driveways sat cracked under the Texas sun. Wind whistled through hollow frames of houses no one would ever live in. And the HOA Welcome Center? Condemned. A county sign now nailed across its glass door read, "Seized by court order." Vivian Ashworth Sterling was nowhere to be seen. Her assets frozen. Her real estate license revoked. Her city councilman husband under investigation. Rumor had it they'd fled to Scottsdale. HOA members who once praised her now treated her name like a curse word, but Rusty never gloated. He didn't need to. Justice had already spoken, in bulldozed lies and resurrected truth. Jake returned to Dallas, law license shining brighter than ever, now nicknamed the Wetland Wrath in legal circles. But not before he handed Rusty a thick folder. Inside, a settlement offer from the title company on behalf of terrified homebuyers. They were willing to pay full market value not to build, just to make the problem disappear. Rusty didn't sign it. Instead, he donated a chunk of the land to the Texas Wildlife Federation, declared it protected, sacred, unbuildable forever. The rest? He reopened the cattle pasture, repaired the fences, replanted native grasses, and every morning he walked the line, not to guard it, but to honor it. Word spread. The ranch that survived the Dust Bowl, cancer, and HOA hell had become legend. Schools sent kids on field trips, a documentary crew visited, and neighbors stopped whispering, started waving. Because Rusty wasn't just the man who fought back. He was proof that small voices get louder when rooted in truth, that your land, your story, and your name mean something, especially when someone tries to pave walls. Verret. If you've ever been dismissed, disrespected, or downright robbed by power in a cardigan, take this story as your battle cry. And if you're still here, still listening, drop "No King in the Cul-de-sac" again in the comments. Let the world know we don't back down. We document, we defend, we endure, and in the end, we win.